Professor Enton's oblique reference in his introduction to the exercise of presidential power affecting the scheduling of this conference was, I believe, a reference to me, because I do work in the White House, and I did call up here and ask that the program be changed in order to accommodate my schedule. But I want to make completely clear that this was not an exercise of presidential power. Now, I want to make that clear because if it had been an exercise of presidential power, I'm sure it would have been improper and would have been grounds for a congressional hearing. Deference, Professor Toulis? Now, I was reading these papers on the plane, which is what you do when you work in the White House, is you read the papers on the plane. And I read Professor Gerhardt's paper first. And I thought, oh, well, this is interesting because I can just take Professor Gerhardt's various criteria and I can apply them to Bill Clinton. And then I thought, better not. Because either I get in trouble back there or I look like a hack here. And I thought, no advantage to that. So instead, I'm going to focus on Professor Toulis's paper. And I have 3 points, really, that I want to make, and I'm going to try to be quick because this panel has gone on for a long time and there's another speaker ahead of me. I have 3 points. The first point relates to what I just said, which is that Congress doesn't seem so deferential from where I sit. The second point is that when Congress is deferential today in the appointments process, it's because deference is in Congress's self-interest. And the third point, and this is a related point, is that if there has been a long-term shift in congressional deference toward judicial appointments, and I'm frankly a little bit dubious about that, but if there has been the long-term shift that Professor Toulis describes, it's because of changes affecting that institutional calculus. It's because of differences in the way Congress calculates its own self-interest with regard to appointments matters. Now, let me start with the first point. The first point is, what deference? Where is this deference? It doesn't seem like supine deference, which is, I believe, the phrase that Professor Toulis uses several times from the vantage point of the White House. Now, consider this. It has been 6 months since President Clinton was reelected. In those 6 months, how many judges have been confirmed? 1. But you said 0, but I'm going to say that 1 is as good as 0, because the 1 was confirmed for various sort of personal reasons that had nothing to do with anything. It might just as well be 0. And look, it doesn't look like there are any coming down the pike, very shortly in the future. There are tens and tens of nominations up there. Not one of them is moving. Indeed, all the people who had hearings before the election are being told that they have to have hearings again. They have to go back to where the process started from for them, even though they had gotten halfway through it. Now, last year was not much better. Last year, it was true, was an election year, although when you actually compare the election year to various other election years in the past, it's a really quite striking, dramatic difference in how few judges were nominated. Senator Kyle is up there talking about how really the Senate ought to have some of the appointments power itself. For every 1 the president does, the Senate ought to do 1. And there are terrifically qualified people sitting up there, let's say Professor Fletcher as an example, who aren't going to get through anytime soon. Now, it's quite clear that Bill Clinton will get some judges confirmed. He'll get some judges confirmed this year. He'll get some judges confirmed in the years to come. But there's also no doubt that his choices will be constrained and that his choices already have been dramatically constrained. It's not an accident that President Clinton appointed Judge Breyer, now Justice Breyer, and Judge Ginsburg, now Justice Ginsburg, to the Supreme Court. It's also not an accident that he did not appoint such people as Peter Edelman to the D.C. Circuit. It's not an accident that Walter Dellinger is not sitting on the Fourth Circuit right now. All of these have to do with a set of constraints that Congress has imposed. So Congress has effectively asserted itself. Now, Congress has not done so, I agree with Professor Toulis, or it has not done so often, in the way that was done in the Bork hearing. It hasn't done so in this highly sort of public, principled, articulate way that we went through in the Bork hearings. And I, like Professor Toulis, I loved what happened in the Bork hearings. I wrote a review of Stephen Carter's book recently where I said, no, he has it all wrong. The Bork hearings were great. The Bork hearings were educational. The Bork hearings were the best thing that ever happened to constitutional democracy. So I share that view with Professor Toulis. But I also think that although we haven't had many of those, we've had something that is as effective from the point of view of constraining presidential choice, which is this whole set of informal, less public, less articulate, less principled constraints on the presidential appointment power of judges. Now, the second point is that any deference that has been given to the president in appointments power is politically driven, is reflective of the political and practical constraints that Congress itself faces. I mean, there comes a point where Congress decides that it looks bad by opposing every appointment, or that it's taking too much time to oppose every appointment. Let me give you one clear example. The day that Tony Lake took himself out of the process for CIA director was the day that everybody in the White House knew that Alexis Herman would have no problem. It was a straight trade-off, one for one. You couldn't go after both. And the fact that they had killed Tony Lake meant that they couldn't kill Alexis Herman. There were these political, practical constraints that they were operating under that made the one appointment go through after the other didn't. So to the extent that Congress abdicates, in Professor Toulis's word, it's not because Congress really believes, oh, we shouldn't be exercising this power. It's not because Congress is a bunch of self-denying folks who really think that this ought to be done by the president. It's because Congress recognizes that people are watching, that people don't like conflict these days. It's because Congress may recognize that the time it will take to defeat certain nominees is not worth the candle. It's because Congress reacts to a set of practical and political constraints. Okay, now the third point, and it really follows from the second point, is that if there has been a shift, as Professor Toulis says there has been, from the 19th century to the 20th century in the extent of deference that Congress has shown to presidential appointments, I think that shift probably follows from certain shifts that have occurred in the set of practical and political constraints that Congress itself faces when considering appointments matters. Now, like Professor Barksdale, I have to admit here that I'm not a historian, and I was kind of reading this and thinking, okay, I should turn it over to Professor Flaherty there, or I should turn it over to some other people in the audience. But let me suggest a few things that may have changed if indeed there has been a shift of the kind that Professor Toulis suggests. Professor Toulis implies, and I think this is probably right, that there may be a shift in terms of the public's own attitudes about what kind of congressional role is legitimate and appropriate. Now, if there has been that shift, of course, there's a deeper question, which is what accounts for that shift in public perceptions of Congress's role. And I'm not quite sure what the answer to that question is. But let me suggest two other things that may play into this, aside from sort of public attitudes about the legitimacy of congressional action. The first is simply that the public is watching now. It might not be that the public felt any better about conflict then than they do now. It might just be that people see the conflict and it disgusts them, and it would have disgusted them if they had seen it before. But the fact that they do see it now, whether it's on C-SPAN or whether it's on your news, local news, is a constraint on what Congress can do. Now, secondly, is that Congress is just expected to do more. I mean, that is, that it has other business aside from appointments, and people expect it to do other business aside from appointments. And that suggests to me that Congress might think now more than it did in the past that, look, you know, this is not an effective use of our time. The opportunity costs are higher. And the people react to Congress that way and so reinforce that congressional sense, which is people sort of see Congress not doing what they consider to be the real business of the nation, but instead to be doing this kind of partisan maneuvering. And so that's another constraint. Mostly, though, You know, I think that these kinds of factors have changed the form and not the extent of partisanship in the appointments process. I sort of, you know, in the end, I think I have to step back and say to Professor Toulis, what has changed is not the amount of partisanship, is not the amount of conflict, is not the extent to which Congress and the President go toe-to-toe and check each other in the appointments process. What's changed is the form in which that's all happened, that it has become more covert, that it has become less direct, but that there are still these terribly effective, maybe more effective by virtue of being more covert, but terribly effective constraints on presidential choice in the appointments process. Thank you.